Good evening, my curious hunters, and welcome back to Bernette's Bazaar about True Tales. This is the podcast exploring the moments where nature breaks its own rules. Our show is where the strange is real and the unsettling is documented, and nature has a habit of being far weirder than fiction. I'm Bernette, and tonight's tale takes us deep into the West Javanese jungle, where floodwaters rose, insects swarmed, and an entire village found itself living beneath a sky of silk, a bizarre ecological anomaly that turned an isolated community into a living laboratory of terror, survival, and an evolutionary panic. Tonight's episode is called 75,000 Spiders. In the late 2007, the region of Tasikmalaya, Indonesia, was drowning. It is both a city and a region in the southeastern part of West Java, located inland among volcanic highlands. It sits roughly east of the Bandung and the southeast of Jakarta in an area known for mountains, rice fields, tropical rainfall, and rural agricultural communities. The rains had come down with a relentless, punishing rate, turning the rich volcanic soil into thick mud and sending rivers over their banks. For weeks, the people of a small rural village outside the main town stayed indoors, listening to the water hammer against their corrugated tin roofs, waiting for the sun to return. But when the rain finally stopped and the thick tropical heat turned the flooded valley into a steaming cauldron, the villagers stepped outside to find that their world had been stolen. It didn't look like Java anymore. It looked like an alien landscape or a frozen nightmare. Spanning across a massive clearing covering 300 meters of terrain was a dense, shimmering cloud. It hung like an opaque, frozen fog over the treetops. It draped across the high voltage power lines like heavy canvas. It swallowed banana leaves, coconut palms, and bushes whole. And when the first brave souls walked up to this massive white structure, they realized the fog was vibrating. It was breathing. Millions of tiny hairy legs were shifting under the midday sun. 75,000 spiders had built a singular, cooperative megastructure, wrapping an entire village ecosystem in a suffocating blanket of silk. Now let's try and understand how 75,000 solitary predators decided to form a single cooperative army. You have to understand the creature at the center of this story. To the casual observer, it's known as a tent-webbed spider. If you were to look at one right now, you might not think much of it. The females are barely 2 centimeters long, with a mottled, bumpy abdomen that looks like a piece of dead, dried leaf or a bit of bird dropping. But it's a brilliant camouflage. They spend their lives invisible, and under normal circumstances, they hate each other, like 99% of all spider species on planet Earth. The tent web spider is fiercely territorial. If two females get too close to one another, the encounter usually ends in cannibalism. They are solitary hunters, fiercely guarding their own small patch of bushes, spinning a highly unique web. Unlike the classic sticky orb webs you find in your garden, the tent web spider builds a horizontal, non-sticky mesh sheet that curves upward like a dome or a canopy. Above and below this dome, They string a chaotic maze of vertical barrier lines. An insect flies along, hits a vertical line, loses its balance, and falls down into the horizontal mesh sheet. The spider, waiting underneath, rushes up, bites through the mesh, drags the insect through, and dives alone. It is an efficient, lonely existence, and for centuries that is exactly how they lived in the agricultural fields. They kept to the shadows of the coffee plants and the banana trees, pest control workers operating in total isolation until the autumn of 2007. The weather patterns in Indonesia that year were volatile. A sudden massive shift in precipitation brought unprecedented deluges to West Java. The ground became completely saturated. The leaf litter, the low-lying shrubs, and the base of the agricultural crops where these spiders built their modest tents were completely submerged under inches of standing water. Imagine being a creature that weighs less than a gram, waking up to find their entire world turning into an ocean. For a solitary spider, options are limited. They can climb. So as the water levels crept higher, thousands of individual spiders abandoned their flooded homes and they began a massive, uncoordinated migration up to the only vertical structures available, the trunks of large trees and the towering wooden and concrete utility poles carrying electricity to the village. At first, it was a race for survival, but as thousands of spiders found themselves crammed into the exact same tree canopies, squeezed together by the rising tide below, something flipped in their primitive brains. A collective survival switch was thrown. Dr. Wang Yu, an entomologist based in Bandung at the time, was one of the first scientists to arrive on the scene after word of the anomaly spread through the local news networks. Decades later, his notes still paint a vivid picture of the sheer scale of the event. We have translated his field journal from that week. The doctor's journal says, October the 14th, we approached the perimeter from a western road. A visual distortion began about 200 meters away. It appeared as though a massive industrial plastic sheet had been dropped over the canopy by an aircraft. But it was not plastic. The air smelled faintly of damp vegetation and something sweet, almost like decaying fruit. When we stepped under the canopy, the light was completely muted. It was a gray, diffused twilight. The silk was so dense it filtered out the tropical sun. Now, what Dr. Rahu and his team discovered was an architectural marvel born out of sheer desperation. Normally, when spiders are forced into close quarters, they fight to the death. But the tent web spider possesses a rare genetic trait, an evolutionary ghost in their machine. They are part of a tiny group of spiders known as conditionally social. This means that while they prefer to live alone, they possess the latent biological hardware to tolerate each other if the environmental payoff is high enough. And the payoff here was survival. Instead of fighting for individual territories, the 75,000 spiders did something unprecedented. They began to link their webs together. Think of it like an emergency housing project built on a massive scale. One spider spun a tent web, and instead of defending that perimeter, it allowed its neighbor to attach another tent web directly to its outer support lines. Then another attached to that one. then another. Over the course of just a few days, these individual structures fused together into one singular, continuous megaweb. It measured over 300 meters in length. It was not a thin, fragile line that you could brush away with your hand. This was a multi-layered, three-dimensional fortress of silk. It coated the leaves, choked out the sunlight from the branches, and stretched across the high-voltage electrical lines like a frozen wave. And because the spider's silk is exceptionally strong and non-sticky, it didn't collapse under its own weight. It formed a rigid, permanent grid system, a metropolitan highway for arachnids. If you stood beneath it, you could see them. 75,000 spiders living millimeters apart, moving across the silk infrastructure like commuters in a crowded subway station. They weren't attacking each other, they were sharing the load. But why didn't they starve? How do you feed an army of 75,000 predators trapped in a single web? The answers lay in the very disaster that drove them there. The floods didn't just displace the spiders, they created the perfect breeding ground for insects. The stagnant, warm floodwaters surrounding the village became a massive nursery for mosquitoes, midgets, and flies. Within days of the rain stopping, the air was so thick with swarms of black insects it was a secondary plague. Walking outside meant breathing in bugs. But for the megaweb, this was an all-you-can-eat buffet of biblical proportions. The 300-meter silk structure was positioned perfectly above the floodwaters, acting as a giant net stretched across the sky. Every minute, thousands of flying insects would slam into the vertical barriers of the megaweb. They would tumble down into the horizontal communal sheets, and the spiders were waiting. Eyewitnesses described the feeding frenzy as synchronized, mechanical operation. An insect would hit the web, and the nearest 3 or 4 spiders would move toward it. There was no fighting over the prey. Whoever reached the insect first claimed it, while the others immediately turned back to wait for the next strike. Because the food supply was so essentially infinite, the spider's natural aggression completely vanished. Evolution had balanced the scales. When resources are scarce, you kill your neighbor. When resources are endless, your neighbor is just another structural support beam for your web. The spiders grew fat, their abdomens swelled. They began to lay eggs within the megaweb, spinning small greenish-looking silk cocoons and suspending them within the communal mesh. The megaweb wasn't just a temporary shelter anymore. It was becoming a permanent self-sustaining city, a city that's slowly encroaching on the human beings living beneath it. For the villagers, the megaweb was not a scientific miracle. It was a psychological horror film brought to life. Imagine waking up, opening your front door, and looking up at the sky, only to see a writhing, pulsing ceiling of 75,000 spiders hanging just feet above your head. The web had completely engulfed the main dirt road leading into the agricultural fields. It draped over the fences, swallowed the communal well, and wrapped around the power lines. The local utility company faced an unprecedented crisis. If the silk became wet with dew or morning mist, it could potentially cause a massive electrical short, cutting off the power to the entire district, or worse, starting a fire that would tear through the silk and the village like tinder. Farmers couldn't get to their crops. even though the spiders were technically doing them a favor by eating the plague of mosquitoes. The sheer psychological weight of walking through a tunnel web, feeling the occasional non-sticky thread drop across your face, was too much to bear. Reactions split across the village. Some people refused to walk beneath the web at all, taking long detours through a flooded side path rather than pass under the shifting weight canopy. Parents called children back from the doorways and windows, warning them not to throw stones, not to touch the silk, not to stand beneath anything that moved. Older residents watched it in silence from shaded verandas and muttering prayers under their breath. A few farmers tried to be practical, admitting the spiders were eating the mosquitoes, but even they crossed the road quickly, shoulders hunched, brushing at their hair and necks long after no thread remained. I knew they were small, one villager later recalled, but when I looked up, I could not see the sky. It felt like the whole roof of the world was alive. I was afraid that if I slept, they would come down with the night. Superstition began to take hold. In rural Java, ancient animist beliefs still run deep beneath the surface of modern life. Some villagers whispered that the mega webs was a curse, a sign that the spirits of the land were angry with the village for disturbing the balance of nature. Others feared that the spiders would eventually run out of insects and drop down from the canopy to feed on the chickens and livestock or sleeping children. Some believed the web should not be touched at all. They warned that tearing it down would offend unseen guardians of the flooded land and invite worse misfortune, more rain, sickness, failed crops, or a death in the family. A few elders told children that spiders falling from the roofs were messengers, not pests, and that killing them inside the house would bring bad dreams. Others tied strips of cloth near the doorways, whispered protective prayers at dusk, or left small offerings of rice and flowers at the edge of the road, hoping the silk would retreat before nightfall. Local leaders held emergency meetings. Should they burn it? But taking a torch to a 300-meter web draped over live electrical lines and dry palm trees was a recipe for disaster. Or do they spray it with chemical pesticides? Now that would poison the village's water supply and kill off the only thing standing between them and a catastrophic malaria outbreak. They were trapped in a state of paralysis, forced to live in lockstep with an alien colony that had set up camp in their backyards. For 2 weeks, the village lived under the shadow of the silk. Children were kept indoors. The nights were dead silent, save for the eerie, faint whistling sound of the tropical wind passing through the millions of tightly woven silk fibers. And then, just as suddenly as it arrived, the environment shifted again. Nature is a clock. It ticks forward, indifferent to the dramas of spiders or humans. By late October, the floodwaters began to recede. The volcanic soil drank the remaining pools of the stagnant water. The breeding grounds for the mosquitoes and the flies evaporated under a week of intense dry heat. Almost overnight, the infinite buffet was closed. As the supply of insects dwindled, the biological truce inside the mega web began to splinter. The 75,000 spiders were suddenly hungry again. The presence of their neighbors, once tolerated as a structural necessity, became a direct threat to their survival. The cooperative city turned into a war zone. But they didn't tear each other apart in a massive civil war. Instead, their solitary instinct reawakened with a urgent command: disperse. One by the thousands, the spiders began to leave the mega web. They climbed down the utility poles, dropped from the banana leaves, and scattered back into the surrounding agricultural fields. They returned to the low-lying shrubs, the coffee plants, and the secret places beneath the dead leaves. They went back to being invisible. They went back to being alone. Left behind was the ghost of their cooperation, a massive, empty 300-meter husk of gray, dust-covered silk, swaying violently in the dry wind. Within a few weeks, the intense tropical sun baked the silk until it became brittle, and the heavy afternoon downpours finally tore the megastructures to shreds, washing the last remnants of the incident into the dirt. By November, if you walked down that same village road, you would never have known that a 75,000 strong arachnid empire had once ruled the sky above. The 2007 Tasikmalaya spider incident remains a striking case study in behavioral plasticity. It shows us that the boundaries we think exist in nature, between the solitary and the social, between the peaceful and the predatory, are highly fluid. When the world changes, when the waters rise and the rules of survival change with them, even the most solitary among us can find a way to weave a common thread to survive the storm. But the next time it rains for weeks on end and the air gets thick, warm, and humid, look up at the trees. You never know what's waiting for the water to stop. Bernette's Bizarre but True Tales is produced by digital storytelling networks worldwide. So if you want to see the original scientific reports, photographic evidence, and the historical archives from the Tasikmalaya silk incident, links will be in the description. If you want to discover more bizarre natural phenomena, check out our episodes on spider rain anomalies or the fish hunting spiders of the Amazon swamp. And that's it for tonight, folks. Until next time, keep your eyes open and don't forget to like and subscribe.